everyone. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm going to talk about a context that maybe some of you are familiar with. It's a large online marketplace for work that can be done remotely. So if you've heard of Upwork, it's a marketplace similar to Upwork. It's places where people can do things that jobs that can be done remotely. So you should like computer programming, graphic design. The way matching happens in this market is kind of similar to what happens in conventional markets. An employer posts a job. They get an algorithmically selected pool of candidates that they might want to consider. So they make recommendations right after you post a job, and that's based on the text of the job description and some kind of things that you fill out. Employers can also go check those workers and see if they're interested. And then the workers can choose to apply or not. Then the employer decides who to hire, if any. One problem in this market is that the sellers here are individual workers. They're not firms, or not, by and large, they're not agencies. So they can easily like stock out. Right? They come and say, you come to a worker and they say, oh no, sorry, I'm not available. And then the employer has to go try to find more people, or very often just won't fill their job because the person they're interested in is not available. This is this kind of like idea of sellers who are inherently supply constrained shows up in a lot of markets. If you're a seller in a real estate market, you typically have one house to sell. Labor market, you typically only have so many hours. A lot of sharing economy platforms where people have brought some asset, they're supply constrained. And in some of these markets, kind of figuring out seller capacity is easy. In labor markets, it can be a problem, and this can make matching kind of difficult, right? So if you're a platform and you recommend an unavailable seller, a match isn't going to happen, right? So you don't want to be recommending houses that have already been sold, a candidate who's not really looking for a job. And if you think about kind of like heuristics that you might apply in some recommender system, if you don't kind of take this into aware, you might make this problem worse. If you kind of say, I'm going to recommend the best seller to everyone, maybe that works for Amazon. But if you say, oh, this guy Dave keeps building good websites, I'm going to recommend Dave to everyone who wants a website, you can kind of see the problem. Okay, so I've actually been kind of trying to solve this problem for too many years now. And I wrote a paper a long time ago that did this kind of the stupidest thing you could imagine, which is like, why don't we just ask the sellers, are you available right now? And we'll just toggle something on and off, and then employers can kind of condition on this. Right? So the platform wasn't doing anything like this. But here we just said, okay, I'm going to just send some information to the market that says I'm available or not. And so, if I kind of decompose my title here, the capacity was the seller's private information. The consequences here was that the buyers were pursuing unavailable sellers. And rather than just going on to the next person, they were often stocking, like just a match wasn't getting formed. And this partial solution was like, let's just ask people. So, you could just take and say, hey, on your profile, please tell us what your capacity is. And then it would be listed there. And then a would-be buyer could condition upon this and kind of make the trade-off, like, well, this person doesn't seem to have a lot of capacity, but, I still want to invite them. But 9 years later, I should get some kind of like reverse impact award for like something that didn't hold up. Because it worked at first. Initially, lots of buyers were kind of, sellers were kind of toggling this back and forth, indicating their availability. And over time, this just collapsed. No one was changing this thing, and everyone just had it pegged out at I'm fully available. And I think you probably are intuiting why. If you're savvy people, you're like, look, job offers are valuable. Why would I ever say, don't give me offers? Maybe if it gets to the point of like spam, but more likely you'd say, oh, give me the offers, then I'll decide what I want to do with them. So this is just some stats just showing how lots of people set it to full time, but their response rate wasn't any higher. So the problem here is that these self-interested sellers, if you can get more offers at zero cost, they're not going to be truthful about their capacity. All right, and the problem here is that this information that was necessary was really missing for economic reasons, not technical reasons. So it didn't really have a technical fix. I should say there's been a lot of effort on the platform to try to infer availability, but it's a very adversarial problem because as soon as you start saying, oh, this is a metric that I'm going to use to indicate it, then people will start gaining on that metric because, again, offers are valuable. So the idea as another solution is, well, why don't we make this cheap talk expensive by introducing costly advertising to the platform? Make sellers pay to say they're available. Despite a promising idea, economists have had a pretty mixed view on the social usefulness of advertising. So the good view is some kind of signaling story about quality, typically. The bad is that it just manipulates preferences and increases costs. And there's even arguments that now with so much more available information that you wouldn't necessarily need this. So what this paper is really about is about a field experiment to try to address this problem by introducing advertising in a market where advertising did not previously exist. So the implementation was really simple. You as a seller on the platform would pay P dollars to the platform to get a badge that's added to your profile that says available now and has a little lightning bolt. If you mouse over, it explains what it is, that it's a paid prominence feature. Okay. The platform's hope was that you'd get the self-selection in where more available sellers would advertise, buyers would seek them out because they know they were more available. That was the idea. The fear is that basically you have a bunch of lemons that choose to advertise, that they're highly available for a reason, and that reason is they're not very good. And if that was the case in equilibrium, you could imagine this whole thing kind of falling apart, because why would I take and seek out sellers who are telling me that they're desperate? Okay. And that this fear idea is kind of well-founded in the literature. So probably like the foundational paper on advertising or econ view on it from Nelson kind of goes into precisely this, like, why would I be interested in someone who's going to be higher costs? Like, what would be my reason? The founder of Costco, kind of put this logic very, very succinctly. This just raises costs. Why would I be interested in an advertiser? Okay, so I think that this is kind of clear. There's a lemons reason why this might work, and then a peaches reason. Lemons why it might not work, and a peaches argument that you hope is true. Okay, let me go a little faster here. All right, so how this is actually implemented, the platform proceeded somewhat cautiously. So let sellers in a technical category of work buy paid advertising if they choose. So took a bunch of sellers, they all had the option to buy this badge. The randomization here is actually on the employer level. So employers were the ones who were randomized. And how they were randomized to either a control group that got the status quo experience, or a treatment group where this badge becomes visible, right? So there's no randomization on who's advertising. The randomization is all on the ability to see this advertising. And if this works, the platform's idea was we'll fiddle with the advertising prices later to optimize information, which itself is kind of an interesting problem. You can imagine if the price is zero, that was kind of the status quo. That's not informative. If the price is so high that no one buys it, that's not informative either. So there's some kind of price here that you think would be maximally revealing, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So uptake was rapid. About 40% of eligible sellers opted in within 2 weeks. Yeah, this is just I already talked through this, but you have a control and a treatment group. The treatment group sees the ads. And a key point here, there was no change in assortment or ranking. Nothing else changed. It was really just the presence of this badge indicating advertising, which is kind of nice because it kind of gives us this kind of pure informational effect as opposed to something where it's like changing around composition. There was about 40,000 would-be buyers in the treatment and control. And so it was just allocated over time. There was no problems with randomization. Okay, so here are the things I want to look at. Do treated buyers seek out advertising sellers? Right? Is this actually like a positive or a negative? And what way we can do this is we get to know who is advertising in the control and the treatment group. Does it kind of send more inquiries in total, or does it just shift around who gets invited? Now you might think like employers are just going to send one invitation. That's not the case. They can send more. So it's not mechanical that it would be crowd out. Like if I choose one person, it doesn't mean that I have to not invite the other person as well. And then just kind of grow the pie, which is like the ultimate hope that you actually get more matches and the stock out problem becomes a little bit smaller. So we can look at the level of individual impressions. So we have about 3.5 million of those. In about 50% of those impressions, the seller was advertising. In only half of those would the treated buyer actually know this. Buyers send invitations to about 8% of the impressions that they see. Okay. So let's just, I can do this graphically. So this is, the x-axis here is the seller position on the buyer's search page. And then the y-axis here is just the probability of receiving a buyer inquiry. So this is just like, hey, would you be interested in my job? And this is the seller's status. So I'm gonna have two, this is when the sellers the buyers can't see the ads. This is sellers who are not advertising. So there's no difference in the treatment and control. Here all sellers are non-advertisers, and holds true generally, no difference. This isn't mechanical, because there could be sort of interaction across the experiments, but this is kind of what you would hope that you would see, that among the people who are not advertising, being assigned to a treatment and control doesn't do very much. Now let's look at what advertising sellers are getting the impression. So these are sellers who are advertising. Here you see pretty large and kind of obvious effects. So if you're in the treatment and you're advertising, you're much more likely to get an inquiry than if you're sent to a control employer. Okay. Another way to visualize this is just to group it differently. So here we just do the buyer status by control, buyer status by treatment. You can see that for control buyers, these advertisers they're under pursued, right? They're below these sellers not advertising. This is kind of a smoking gun of why they probably want to advertise. Like in some sense, they're getting overlooked. And then in the treatment, the gap is somewhat more than closed. So before, when they were with control buyers, they were kind of being overlooked. When they're in the treatment, you actually see them doing better. Okay, we don't know why. We just know that they are. So we can move to a different view. As buyers of the unit of randomization, and look at this, what happens at the buyer level. So here, this is just the number of buyer inquiries sent. This is just a coefficient on whether or not ads were visible to them. You can see, and so this is kind of getting at this little bit of this stock out concern. We can see that treated buyers here, treated employers, they sent about 3% more inquiries overall. So there's actually some space for this not to just be a pure crowd out story. If we see inquiries to advertisers, this obviously goes up a lot, right? But now we look at non-advertisers, it's essentially a zero, close to it. So this is pretty surprising to us. We thought that this was like, this may be worth doing, but it was going to really hammer the people who choose not to advertise. Empirically, that's not what happened at all. So it seems to increase the total number of inquiries. It doesn't just crowd things out. All right, but what about, what does this do to the market overall? You actually get an increase in the applicant pool. So this is proposals received from inquiries. So this is like what was sort of the realized applicant pool that you had. Because remember, just because someone was invited, it doesn't mean that they're going to accept. So the pool of available candidates expanded a little bit. And then if we actually look at contracts formed, we actually see about a 3% increase in contracts formed. So this is the pie getting sort of marginally bigger. 3% is not a huge effect, but if you kind of consider that this is maybe a couple hundred lines of PHP and the platform makes money from it, that's kind of a pretty good thing. All right, so let's go back to this question. Why do they seek out advertisers? Like, what's the reason? Well, if we actually compare advertisers and non-advertisers, and this isn't experimental, this is just observation, just comparing their attributes. You can see that advertisers and non-advertisers, they had stated nearly identical availability. But I kind of already showed you that this was true because everyone just lies and says they're 100% available. But the advertisers have more complete resumes, they have higher feedback scores from past contracts, and they're asking lower wages. So they look like they're better than non-advertisers. And if you look at their probability of accepting an inquiry from an employer, they're much more likely to say yes. So they really were available now. We didn't get to choose that term; that was a marketing term. But there was it kind of caused some confusion anyway. If you work with a company, you got to make compromises. So in a nutshell, they were better. They were slightly underpriced as far as we can tell, and they were actually keen on taking on more work, which is kind of somewhat obvious. Like that's who you would expect would be interested in this kind of feature. If you kind of do this just like in a regression, how am I doing on time?
You're okay. You have 4 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you can take and turn these into a bunch of standardized predictors, and it just kind of shows the same thing I just talked about. That you have kind of sellers who are selecting into advertising tend to be better, but not getting as much work as they probably would. Okay, so one concern you might have is that maybe advertising sellers change their behavior or prices. And so we can kind of we can do a diff and diff and see, hey, maybe I start advertising, but I kind of pair that. I think it gives me a little bit of market power, and I pair that with an increase in price. We don't see any evidence that they were changing their bids at all. So they just advertise without changing the prices. Okay, so what about in equilibrium? I was gonna maybe stop the talk here, but I think I can have another minute. You could take, you might want to kind of look at like, well, what happens when this becomes sort of broadly available? Now you've doubled the number of employers that can see advertising. Well, there's not you're kind of moving away from the like rock solid experimental world where you can say precisely what happened to kind of somewhat shaky eyeballing things, event study, diff and diff land. But if you kind of broadly look at what happened when they rolled it out to the platform as a whole, and so this is just kind of like an interrupted time series where here the control is not a true control, it's just a whole bunch of other categories where this wasn't quite rolled out. You maybe see some evidence that the treatment effects on contracts formed possibly was the same and kind of held out in equilibrium, but I wouldn't too much stock in this. I think just like a final thought, and this is probably more EC relevant than the normal econ audience. A lot of platform marketplaces are using this kind of structure to raise revenue, where they're introducing advertising that is potentially bringing sellers who are paying into it. And there's these questions about who's selecting in. And if depending on what you charge, in our case, it happened to be that you had virtuous sellers kind of selecting into advertising. But that may not generally be true. And there's another paper by Sarah Moshri and co-authors that kind of do something very similar in the eBay context and find that the advertisers tend to be bad, like the organic sellers are actually better. I think there's some interesting questions about if you're going to have this sort of system, is there some kind of way that you can subsidize sellers to make sure you get that result of that your advertisers are virtuously selected? Because I think if you think about it this way, if they're not virtuously selected, you're going to train buyers to ignore your advertisers. And then the whole thing either falls apart, or you kind of like really have to put your thumb so strongly on the scale for your advertisers that with like prominence that you're kind of like harming your customers this way. If you can make it so that your advertisers are virtuously selected, it's kind of like free money. Like it helps sort of solve this matching friction, and the platform raises revenue, which you could either like lower the take rate elsewhere or do other good things. So I think I'll probably stop there.